Okay, thank you for attending. My name is Bruce Miller. I'm with RimTech Consulting, and this is our typical webinar. It's not a usual webinar. We're not selling anything. So it's wide open. Feel free to interrupt at any time and ask a question. Just open your mic or send a question in via the chat. This session will be recorded, and I'll be sending an email out tomorrow to all registrants with a link to the recording. Okay? So let's get into it. How to tackle metadata in a typical modern EDRMS. So by EDRMS, I mean Electronic Document and Records Management System. So the whole idea of metadata is to get rid of this. This is an actual statistic from one of my clients. Over 20 years, they accumulated 3.5 million documents in 275,000 folders. Can you believe it? That's 13 documents per folder over 20 years. That's 275,000 places to look for documents. So the whole idea of SharePoint, of course, is to make that go away. No more folders. So what the heck is metadata? Well, it's descriptive data about a document stored in SharePoint. So here's two examples, expense reimbursement and fleet vehicle maintenance. And just look at the difference between the two. Okay, so now with this metadata for these two activities, expense reimbursement and fleet vehicle maintenance, you can search, sort, and filter by these pieces of metadata. That's what makes it really, really useful. So metadata should only exist if it's needed either for compliance or for retrieval, and perhaps for workflows. But I've noticed over my career, a lot of SharePoint experts, quote unquote, I've noticed that some of them say, oh, metadata is terrible. It's awful. It's the worst thing I've ever seen. I don't like it. I don't want it. And we won't build it. And the other people say, well, it's fantastic. We need more. And everything in between. It's painfully subjective. So I'm going to throw my hat in the ring and say, well, what is the right amount of metadata? Is it, who know who's right and who's wrong? Well, I think what it is the right amount of metadata is whatever helps the users find their documents. Okay. Now, the burden of putting documents into SharePoint with a lot of metadata is just that, it's burden. People had to fill out a lot of metadata fields. But we have ways around that I'll introduce you to, okay? So the right amount of metadata, in my opinion, supports retrieval, compliance, and workflow. Turns out that across our client base, in a healthy EDRMS, we typically deploy 14 metadata fields, what SharePoint calls columns, per library. But the good news is that the user typically only has to enter 2.1 fields on average every time they put a document in. So that's a really good balance. So here's the theory of metadata, right? In the old days, we had folder structures, projects, project types, project year, etc. Now we can have one storage location in SharePoint called projects, and we can have a metadata field for each one of these previous nesting levels, folder nesting levels. So of course, the goal of all of these projects is to achieve compliance. And again, compliance is way too subjective. So we gotta button this down. And here's how I button it down. Compliance to me means that every document in SharePoint adheres to the retention schedule. And how? Well, they're managed as records, and that means that they're immutable. They cannot be deleted or edited. There's a retention rule assigned to each one. And most importantly, is that all of your case-based records, what we call case-based, they're business activities that are triggered by an event. Those have to be properly managed as well. The modern record software can't even work without this. So the ultimate proof is, can we do a disposition? Well, in order to do that, you got to have confidence that the classification accuracy rate is high enough to support it, typically over 85%. So that's a tall order. How do we do that? Well, turns out that in a typical modern EDRMS, let's say for 1,000 users or so, the average number of records per person per day is 12. So that means a flow rate of 12,000 records per day. And if any of you think that you can stick your finger in that flow rate, you're sadly mistaken. That's just not going to happen. So 12,000 records arrive at the front door, so to speak, every single day. That's too many for the records manager to get involved with. You can't check it, test it, measure it, or correct anything. And I'm going to make the case, I hope I can make the case, that we can't rely on end users to do any of this. So that means that we have one option left only, and that's automation. So everything I show you in this session is independent of technology, okay? There are 5 records management software products out there for SharePoint, and it doesn't matter which of the 5 you use. So this is the first point I want to make. We can't, you know what I know, I think instinctively, which is that if I give one document to 10 different people and ask them 2 questions, 1, is this a record? 2, where does it belong in the retention schedule? I'm likely going to get up to 10 different answers. And then if I do the same thing a month later, I'll get 10 different answers. And not many of them will be right. So the conclusion there is that we cannot rely on end users, okay? The second thing is look at the volume. 12,000 a day is 60,000 a week, or 2.7 million per year. Where does that number 12 come from? It's very simple. It's 50 inbound emails per day, 20% of which meet the business definition of a record. 2 non-emails, i.e. documents created per day, total 12. That's how we get 12, okay? At that pace, there is no way that the records manager can do anything with 12,000 records. You're not going to check them, test them, evaluate them, look at them, read them, nothing. Totally hands off. And that assumes 1 minute per record. So if you took 1 minute per record, in one single day, you would need 25 days of work in order to process or examine each of these records. And that obviously is not going to happen. So therefore, records managers cannot interfere or intervene with modern digital records. So that begs this question: where does compliance come from? 2 schools of thought. One school of thought says compliance comes from end users. In other words, they're responsible for picking the right retention rules. The other school of thought says, are you out of your mind? There's no way we're going to do that. People can change their mind every day of the week, and they don't care, and they're not motivated. They've never lost a job because they didn't play the game. So there's no way we're going to depend on that. So we're going to have to impose compliance on the users, even against their will. Which of these 2 is right? Well, in my opinion, the model where we impose it works, okay? And the other model where we depend on users, it does not work. I've never seen it work, and I don't ever expect to see it work. Fortunately, most software vendors have long learned this lesson, and the only way to use their products is by automation. One of them, namely Microsoft Purview, out of the box is the opposite. It's the posture of Purview is records compliance comes from end users. So to get that product deployed properly, you have to turn it right side up. Okay, so before we tackle the metadata itself, there are 2 absolutely critical prerequisites we have to cover. 1 is what the heck are case records? And 2 is we need to figure out the SharePoint information architecture. All of that will drive metadata. So case records are 60% or more of all of your records. And it's the single biggest mistake that I see in EDRMS projects. In my opinion, about 95% or higher of all EDRMS projects are failures. And that's one of the 2 key reasons is failure to manage case records properly. The second thing is that the fact that you have these case records means that it will have a profound effect on how SharePoint is deployed. Profound effect. So what are they? Case records are records that are from case business activities. A case business activity is an activity about a person, a place, an event, or a thing. And what they all have in common is that they all end. Okay? So it's a series of repeated business processes. For example, audits. You might do a health and safety audit in February. It'll come to an end. You might do a financial audit in July. It will also come to an end. But both audits are two completely different adventures. Each one generates a set of records that are different from and independent of the other adventure. So we call each adventure a case. So in this case, no pun intended, the case structure or cases are audits. Each audit is a case. So here are three more examples: contracts, employees, and projects. Each are case activities, and each has a retention rule triggered by a event date, contract end date, employment termination date, or project end date. So the retention rule is triggered by the end date, okay? And the disposition normally would destroy all the records related to that particular case, that contract, that audit, or that project. The opposite, 40% of the time, are admin or non-case records, and they're triggered by the document's date. So what the software does is it takes today's date, subtracts the document date from it. That yields the age of the document. Then it compares the age to the retention period. If it's younger, it's kept. If it's older, then it's marked for disposition, whatever that may be. Now, here's where it gets a little tricky. In SharePoint, if we have 1,000 contracts, which isn't that unusual, then there's a reality that sets in, which is anytime a user attempts to put a document in SharePoint about a contract, we have no choice but to force that user to tell us which contract it's related to. How do we do it? Well, the mechanism can vary, but it can be a drop-down list, a pop-up list, a flyout list, but it's got to be a list that they're forced to choose from. There is no mathematical way around that. You can put it another way, we can't walk up to SharePoint with a document and say, look, I've got a document about a contract, but it's a big secret. I'm not going to tell you which contract it's about. That's just crazy. So for every case activity, which in this case would be employees, projects, or contracts, yeah, every time the user puts a document in there, we've got to give them forcibly a choice of 1,000 contracts. What contract is this document related to? What employee is this one related to? And so forth. Okay? There's no way around that. If you have 11,000 employees, you're going to present a list of 11,000. There is no choice. So here's an example of a retention schedule with exactly 253 categories in it, okay? Let's assume for the moment that a category or business activity in the retention schedule is going to become a storage location in SharePoint, otherwise known as a library, okay? Now, regardless of what we call the storage locations, our 12,000 records have to go somewhere. So every day by 5 o'clock, 12,000 records are flying at SharePoint. Where are they going to go? You got to go somewhere. You have to decide where to go, right? So we have 60% of those 12,000 are case records. That means 7,200 are going to fly towards SharePoint at 3 libraries: contracts, employees, and projects. But wait, every one of those 3 has 1,000 different cases in it. Am I a document about contract 707 or am I about contract 808? Well, you need 1,000 places in SharePoint for those contracts, 1,000 places for employees, and 1,000 places for projects. So 7,200 out of those 12,000 per day are flying towards 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 places in SharePoint that we have to build. What about the other 4,800? Well, those others are not case records. They're going straight into the categories. There are no cases involved. So that would be 250 different targets or locations in SharePoint. So the grand total is 3,250 places that you have to build in SharePoint for this scenario, okay? And we're not talking about other cases like vehicles, union grievances, investigations, nothing like that. Facilities, right? Lots and lots of these case records. This is just a smidgen. So that's the reality of case records. It has a profound impact on how SharePoint is deployed. Now let's take a deeper look into how we are going to deploy SharePoint. That'll set us up for the metadata. Think of it as a three-layer cake. The first layer, let's say that we have 1,000 users and 800 categories, which is about right. That means 60% of the categories in the retention schedule, or 480, are shown on the right here, and the retention tags are assigned to the cases. Whereas 320 of those categories, the retention tag is assigned directly to the documents, okay? So the software must be instructed with this. Am I a case category or am I not? Because it uses a totally different algorithm to calculate disposition, right? So now let's move up the ladder to SharePoint. What do we have? Well, we have 800 libraries. Each category in the retention schedule equates to a library of the same name. What about metadata? Well, each library needs metadata, so we're going to put some metadata into each library relevant to that activity. And the container of metadata is called a content type. Either way, each of these 800 libraries will have metadata different from the other 799, because if it was the same, it would be the same activity and therefore redundant. So we have 480 libraries on the right, broken into document sets for each case, and we have 320 on the left that are not broken into document sets. Now let's move up to the top. This is where the magic happens, and this is where most modern records managers fail to understand EDRMS. This is the content automation rules. This is what makes the system work. It's what I call the beating heart of an EDRMS. So regardless of which product you buy, you're going to have to create automation rules that apply retention rules to SharePoint content 24/7. Okay? Now, once you write these rules, and you can see an example here, one rule might say, if the library name is union grievances, then the retention will be 10 years after the settlement date. Or if the library is operator rounds and approved equals yes, then the retention is X years. So these rules, we call them content rules. These rules up top here in your record software, they contain the name of the libraries and the metadata. So what does that mean? That means that if you noodle around with the name of the library, the rule breaks. If you noodle around with the name of the metadata fields, the rule breaks and you're no longer compliant. So the effect that this has is it locks together all three layers like Lego blocks tightly. And when it's built and operational, don't touch it. Don't touch it. It works. Leave it alone. So you can't go around with people creating sites and libraries every day of the week, throwing documents in willy-nilly. That's not governable. We call that SharePoint in the wild. That must stop. And you must have predictable metadata and predictable libraries so you know what's in each library. Without that, there's no way for these automation rules to work. So a compliant SharePoint is by definition static. It is not dynamic, adding and subtracting libraries every day of the week. It's got to stop. Now, this is what I call the beating heart of the system. We have two types of rules, not one. Most records professionals make the mistake of thinking, well, I have 250 categories in my retention schedule, and that's probably 50 or so uniquely different retention rules. And all I got to do is get them in the software and I'm good. Nope, you couldn't be further from the truth. This is a diagram you need to see. On the right, we have our retention rules. How many? 50 maybe, typically, to 100 max. They're just combinations or permutations of the trigger, the period, and the action, right? triggered by age, 5-year retention period, and then destroy as one example. There's not many of them. You could pump these into any one of those 5 software products in an afternoon, but it's not going to get you anywhere. You have to create these things on the left called content rules. Content rules. They're not called content rules in any of the 5 software products. For example, in Microsoft Purview, they're called auto-apply policies. They are called content rules in I think, Collabware, yes. They're called Lifecycle by Gimmal. They're called Patterns and Outcomes by RecordPoint. They all have different names. Doesn't matter. The principle of all 5 is identical. So a content rule, sorry about that, a content rule says, for this content in SharePoint, please assign this retention rule from my little tiny list of 50 rules. For example, here we have audits. We have a higher retention value for the final report than everything else. So we have a metadata field, a column called final report. If there were 1,000 documents in here, presumably only one would have final report equals yes. For that, we're going to apply the retention rule called audits final report, which is rule 7, audit end date plus 10 years and destroy. What about the other 999 in that library? Well, they'll have final report equals no. So we assign this rule 5 and destroy to it. Okay. And if we look at the green library here, projects, we can have a document, a column, a metadata field called document type. And we can have a different retention rule for each document type in that library. So on and on and on. It turns out that the average quantity of content rules per library is 3. So that's where I got the 2,400. If you have 800 libraries, which you typically would for an organization of 1,000 people, then you would have 2,400 content rules, okay, that you have to write. Here's an example from Collabware. You can see the condition here, which is the column name is department, the operator is equal to, and the value is administration. When the department equals administration, they will apply a retention rule to it. Here's Gimmal, same thing. On the left here are your SharePoint properties, which are the metadata columns, the fields, operator, value, and they have a join. So you can join multiple conditions together to say, this is the content that I'm talking about. Here's an example from Opus by AvePoint. Very simple. Apply term by. What's a term? A term is a retention rule. The green retention rule on the right, the list from the list of 50, auto-populate a term based on criteria. The criteria is what lies between the if and the then. And when the condition is met, apply the following retention rule. So you can see the pattern here, right? The column approved equals yes, or the column approved by matches Smith. This is just an example of the kinds of things you can do with conditions, but pretty sophisticated. You can add, mix, and match a lot of conditions here. What about Microsoft Purview? Same thing, only it looks, feels, and operates a lot different, but it's exactly the same principle. Look at this. Apply label to content that contains specific words, phrases, or properties. What's a label? A label is a retention rule. Okay, and here's the label right here. 10 years, review, delete. So what are we going to apply the label to? Well, here's your content rule, which is called an auto-apply rule policy in Purview. So refinable string 45 equals audits and refinable string 00 equals reports. Yeah, that's a bunch of technical babble speak for sure. That's actually a mini programming language called key query language. It used to be called key word query language, but apparently it's been renamed to key query language now. Yes, you have to learn it and apply it, but it's exactly the same principle. Content rules utilize retention rules. So I think now you know enough to be dangerous here about metadata. So let's get into it. Metadata, they're called The fields are called columns. Every column in SharePoint has two names. It actually has three, but we don't care about the third one. So it has a display name and a column name, an internal column name. Here's an example. You might have a column called end date or event date, but you can have a display name of project end date in the projects library, contract end date in the contracts library, and so on. Those three libraries are using the same column in three different locations, but the context is different in each. Okay, so it's still an end date or event date, but it's used in three different places, but it's just the same column. Okay. Now, there are two species of columns in SharePoint, site columns and library columns. You need to know the difference. Site columns are centrally stored at the site level, and you can reuse them across many different sites. And that makes propagation easy. And what I mean by that is that if you want to make a change to one of those columns, you make it in one place and it automatically propagates out to every other site that uses that column. So maintenance is very easy. Library columns, however, are restricted only to a single site. So uh, if you wanted to make a change to 17 different sites, you would have to make the change 17 times. So site columns are pretty popular. We have a rule here at RimTech, which is pretty much all of the site columns that we create are site columns. Okay. Now, there's an evil downside to site columns you need to be aware of, and that's this. Let's suppose you have a field, let's call it approved by, in 10 different sites, each site being a business unit or department or work group, whatever you want to call it. And approved by, the column approved by is mandatory in every single site. But one of the 10 wants it, needs it, optional. What are you going to do? Well, you can't force optional on all 10. So you go to that particular site and you change it to um, uh, to make it optional. Okay, if it's mandatory everywhere else, then you make a change in one site. If you do that, everything works fine. But 6 months later, if you make a different change to that column, then it propagates the column out and it clobbers the one business unit, the one site that had that in a different mode. It had it optional instead of mandatory or whatever, right? So you'll be completely blindsided by that. We call it clobbering. So any local change to a site column will get automatically clobbered if there's a change made to that column at the site level. Okay, there's a huge risk of that. Whereas the library columns, you don't have that problem, right? Because the column only exists in that particular site. Now, as I said before, every column has an internal column name and a display name. So here is a screen capture from SharePoint. It says column name. What it really should say is column display name, project and date. Okay. So here you can see column name is project end date. That's actually the display name. But if you look above in the URL, I've magnified it down here. You'll see field equals. This is the internal date that SharePoint assigns to the column. You cannot change that ever for any reason. Why do we care? Well, most of us don't, but you could care if you're using Microsoft Purview, and you could care if you're using any workflows. So every document in SharePoint obviously has metadata. Here's an example of some 6 fields for contracts. I think you would agree that these are useful for any generic contract, right? But I highlighted number 2 and number 5 in red because those are what I consider to be non-negotiable, mandatory compliance metadata fields because we cannot be compliant without those two. We have to have an end date to calculate disposition, and we have to know which of the 1,000 contracts we're applying that date to, right? So it turns out that in an EDRMS project, you have 2 layers of metadata. Layer 1 is this red stuff, the non-negotiable mandatory compliance metadata. And the black columns are the what we call business metadata, stuff that's useful for retrieval. So how does metadata get assigned? Through a mechanism called a content type. Here I have two types, 1 and 2, contracts and travel, both of which have the same 5 base columns. Okay, and the contracts has the red fields, travel has the green fields. So somehow magically, I put 3 documents into SharePoint, and one way or the other, they ended up with a content type called contracts. So I had to fill out the red fields. Same deal with the travel, I had to fill out the green ones. So how do the documents get attached to that particular content type? Well, here's how. The content type is assigned to the library or the location in SharePoint. So if I put a document in location 1 and it has the content type contracts assigned to it, I had to fill out the red contract fields. Similarly with travel. And if I happen to have a storage location, i.e. a library, with 2 content types, well, I can choose which of the 2 I want. I can mix and match them. Now, here's where, so far so good. We know what metadata is, how to assign it. We're on our way. But this is where the wrinkle comes in really quickly. And you don't discover this until you're well into your deployment. We call it column variance. Really, really tough situation. So here's an example. We have a column called approved by, right? Usually it's humans who approve things, right? So we have 3 business units, each of which is a site, 1, 2, and 3. The folks in business unit 1 want it mandatory. They wanted a person group list, which is bring up a list of SharePoint users so I can pick one for approval. And they only want one single person to approve it. This is the normal thing you would do. But you know what? 6 months later, we're doing another business unit and they want it optional and they want to have 2 people to approve it. So they want a multiple selection field. And another 6 months, and now someone else says, well, we need approved by, it has to be mandatory, but we can't pop up a list of users because we have people from outside agencies approving. So we have to type it in. It has to be a text field. Oh my God. Now look at what we've done. We've got 3 variants of the same column. Who wins? Nobody. Each business unit has their requirements and they got to have what they got to have. So if you're not thinking it through, then you would have to create 3 columns, approved by PG, approved by OPT, approved by text, or whatever you want to call it, but they're all different columns because they have different configurations, okay? So now multiply that by 14 columns times 800 libraries. That's a total of 11,200 column usages, not columns, but column usages, or what we call mappings, right? Because columns are often reused across multiple libraries. So now you've got to manage all of these variants. Good luck with that. That's a nightmare. So let's talk about the content type hub and see how we might deal with this. You would think the fix comes with a content type hub. How does that work? Well, the variants are separated columns, the separate columns. It's beautiful for propagation. If you want to make a change, you can send the column out you make one change at the master, and it propagates out to all other sites where that column is used. So it sounds seductively good at the beginning, okay? But again, we have the same problem, which is we have to have if we have 3 different columns with 3 different variants, we have to have 3 different columns, right? We prefer to do this. We prefer independent sites, no content type hub. That way, each business unit can have their own variant and it will be called approved by. And it's simple, easy to maintain. And the beauty of it is that you don't have to worry about standardizing on one column name for all users because once you get into variants, you have to manage those variants. Here, variants are not a problem. So we like that. The only downside is that if you wanted to change a column which was used in 15 different sites, you would have to make that change 15 different times. There's no propagation. So what's the fix? The fix is write a script to do it. And a script is very quick and easy to do, and probably safer than doing it with the user interface anyway. So that's what we do anyway. So as you know, SharePoint Workspace, I should say, has sites, libraries, and then in it, there's a magical thing which you must know about, document sets, okay? We don't like folders, so we use document sets. A document set is intended for a group of related documents. That's why they call it document sets. But it has a magical property that makes it ideal for EDRMS. And here's what we have here. Take a look at this. We have two sites, internal audit on the left, finance on the right. Each has three libraries. But guess what? Both of them have a contracts library. Interesting. So the document sets are perfect for cases because, as you know, every contract is a case. It has to be separated from all other contracts. So if we have 1,000 contracts, we'll have 1,000 document sets. That's the mechanism that we use for cases in libraries. But here's a rub. The two business units, they don't want the other business units sticking their fingers into their business, which is kind of normal. So that means that we have to deploy a contracts library twice, once for internal audit and once for finance. Nothing wrong with that at all. It's the same metadata, same retention treatment, same everything. It's just that there's one group of documents, contract documents emerging in internal audit, and a different set of documents emerging in finance. In fact, finance might have different cases than the internal audit. That's okay too. Nothing wrong with that, right? So that means that each library in SharePoint has what we call three modes of operation: local, common, or shared. Local means the library exists in only one place in that business unit, that site, and nowhere else. A common library means every business unit engaging in that activity has their own library, identical to all others, but their records are unique to them. Shared means one library and multiple business units are actually sharing it, meaning that they can delete each other's documents and so on. Takes a high level of trust. Here we have 4 business units, each with 4 categories or libraries, SharePoint libraries. No two are alike. But here, business unit 2, research, has common 6, which is an activity they're engaged in, and so is business unit 3 and 4. Same activity, same everything, but different records from them. And they don't want the other 2 to stick their fingers in their business in common 6. Here's an example of BU2 again, has an activity called shared 6, and they invited BU1 to join them. So the users in BU1 can delete, edit, modify, do whatever they want in that library. So it's a very, very high level of trust. So that's common versus shared categories. Now, remember, we needed to handle cases. Here's an example from procurement, competitive procurement. You'll notice when we go into that library, we have 7 document sets. Each document set represents a procurement adventure. This one is buying a bucket truck. This one is procuring landscape services, and so on. Okay? What you need to know is that in SharePoint, a document set has a very special magical property that makes it perfect for cases. And that's called shared fields. Shared fields. So what the heck is a shared field? Well, this diagram explains it. Here are 3 cases, or in SharePoint, 3 document sets in a library. Fields F1 through F5 are shared columns. fields F6 and F7 are non-shared. The shared columns are entered by the Records Manager once only, and only when the case is created. And the values are automatically replicated across every document that flows into that document set. Whereas fields F6 and F7, which we call document fields, those are entered by the user, and the values are unique to that document. Okay? So that means that the users don't have to type the contract name 100 times or the vendor 100 times or the dollar amount 100 times. It's only in once. So the orange fields are case level and the green fields are document level. So as I said earlier, this is the scenario we've got here. 800 categories, 480 of which are case categories, which will become libraries, and 320 are not, no document sets. Average 14 columns per library. So that would be 11,200 column mappings, because there's a lot of reuse of columns across libraries, maybe 750 unique columns in total. So this is an example of that. And yes, this is a real spreadsheet with 11,200 rows in it that, yes, I did enter manually. That's what it takes to build a SharePoint IA. So here we have 3 business activities: acquisitions, analysis, and audits. You'll notice that each one of them has an end date column, end date, and end date. But the display name is acquisition end date, analysis end date, and audit end date. But it's the same column, end date, same column. And to the right here, we have all of the necessary SharePoint parameters of each column, such as, is it mandatory or optional? Is it a text field, a date field? Is it a drop down? Is it a list? And so on. So yeah, we have to build 11,200 of these rows. Now here's from the inside looking out. This is what does a metadata look like for audits? Well, there are 13 columns here. Now look down at the bottom. We have 7 content rules. Content rules contain metadata. Here we have the rule, if critical equals yes, retention equals permanent. That means that the critical column is used in a retention rule. That makes it a non-negotiable mandatory compliance field. Okay, so of this set of 13 metadata fields, 3 of them are compliance, necessary for compliance. The top 9 are entered by the Records Manager only when this case is created. The bottom 4 are entered by the user, but the user really only has to enter 2 of them, subject and document type, because the other 2 are defaulted, so they don't need to worry about those, okay? And you'll notice as well that 4 of the 13 are lists, audit type, pertinent regulations, etc. So where do these lists come from? Well, it turns out there are 5 types of lists in SharePoint. You're going to want to use number 5, manage metadata. Why? Because the lists change over time. And with a choice list, you have to call IT and have them make the change. But with managed metadata lists, you can farm it out to representatives in each department who can manage their own lists without calling IT. That's what a managed metadata field looks like. It's actually hierarchical. Here's an example of a term set, which is what SharePoint calls a list, a term set. And the values in the term sets are called terms. And the collection of all the term sets or lists is called the term store, right here. So that's it. That's all we have time for today. I wanted to leave a bit of time for questions. But before I go, I wanted to tell you what we're up to when it comes to metadata. We're up to a lot. We've come up with this tool called Catalyst, and we use it internally for our clients. But what we do is we have a packaged retention schedule, software ready, with 2,200 categories in it for municipalities, mostly. But 600 of them are generic, which is still a good number. But the real value to this is that each of those 2,200 categories has the 14 metadata columns already defined for it. And as if that wasn't good enough, we can press a button and have it all deployed in SharePoint in a day, in some cases even less. So what does this mean? Well, these are the 6 steps you have to follow in order to deploy an EDRMS. There's no choice. You have to define a new or different retention schedule, then generate it in machine readable format, load it into your record software of choice. Are you done? Not even close. So far, this should have taken you an afternoon. Now, this could have taken you a year, but nonetheless, you're there. Now, you've got the defined SharePoint information architecture, which means your 800 libraries, your 11,200 columns, build it into a spreadsheet. Step 5, hand that spreadsheet over to IT and say, I hope you're not too busy this afternoon. Would you mind building this for me? That is going to take them 6 months minimum. And only when that is finished can you do number 6, which is your content rules, those 2,400 content rules. Why? Because the SharePoint architecture has to be in place. Because when you enter your rules, it's checking to see that the library exists, that the metadata exists. So you're the last person in. Yeah, the very last. So with Catalyst, what we've got is we've done away with this step completely, taken a year, at least a year out of the project. And what we're working on now is automating those 2,400 content rules, so to take that out of play as well. So uh, definitely there are faster, easier ways to do it, and with a lot less error. So in summary, this is what you need for a healthy EDRMS. You have to automate. There's no choice but to automate. You've got to get this architecture right. You can't have libraries and sites popping up all over the place in the wild. It's not going to work. It has to be static and stable, including your case records. You got to create hundreds, if not thousands, of content rules. That's what makes the system work, and they don't fall out of the sky. That is your main effort level right there. We highly recommend you use site columns, not library columns, and avoid the content type hub. We think that will pay off hugely when you're doing large deployments like we typically do. So that is it. I'll stop and ask if there's any questions. You can either use your mic or the chat, whichever you prefer. Don't be shy. Okay, no questions. That's fine. Thank you all for attending. I really appreciate that you took an hour out of your busy day to listen to me for an hour. That's a lot to ask. So again, I really appreciate it. And stay tuned for lots of more webinars and keep an eye on our training as well. Okay. Oh, we might have a question here. No, just thank yous. That's fantastic. I really appreciate it. And we'll hopefully see you at the next webinar.